Moses is one of the most influential figures in history, known for leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and receiving the Ten Commandments from God. His story is powerful, filled with moments of struggle, triumph, and divine intervention. This tale will explore every detail of his life: who he was, his family, what drove him to accomplish so much, and how he became a central figure in the history of faith. Imagine being born into a world where your very existence is a threat to the ruling powers. This was the reality for Moses, a Hebrew child born into slavery under the oppressive rule of Egypt. The Pharaoh, fearing the growing population of the Hebrews, had issued a decree that all newborn Hebrew boys should be killed. Yet, despite the odds, Moses not only survived but went on to change the course of history. From a hidden child to the liberator of a nation, Moses' life is a journey of faith, courage, and endurance. He encountered hardships, faced doubts, and questioned his own abilities. But through it all, his unwavering commitment to fulfilling God's plan kept him on course. Moses was born to Amram and Jochebed, members of the Hebrew tribe of Levi, during a time of intense persecution for the Hebrews in Egypt. His parents, devout and faithful to their God, took great risks to save his life. After his birth, Jochebed hid Moses for 3 months, but when she could no longer keep him concealed, she placed him in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile River, trusting that God would protect her child. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Hebrews 11:23. As divine providence would have it, the basket was discovered by none other than Pharaoh's daughter, who was bathing in the river. Touched by the sight of the baby, she decided to adopt him, raising Moses as her own in the palace. His sister Miriam, who had been watching from a distance, approached Pharaoh's daughter and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. Jochebed, Moses' own mother, was thus able to care for him in his early years. This remarkable turn of events placed Moses in the unique position of being raised as both a Hebrew and an Egyptian. He learned the ways of the Egyptian royal court, receiving the best education and training available, while also retaining his connection to his Hebrew roots. This dual identity would become a key factor in shaping Moses' destiny. As Moses grew older, he began to witness the suffering of his people, the Hebrews, who were enslaved and forced into harsh labor under the Egyptians. His heart was troubled by the injustice and cruelty he saw. Despite being raised as an Egyptian, Moses felt a deep connection to his Hebrew heritage and could not ignore the plight of his people. One day, Moses encountered an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Overcome with anger and a sense of justice, Moses intervened and killed the Egyptian. Realizing the consequences of his actions, he fled Egypt to escape Pharaoh's wrath, seeking refuge in the land of Midian. This moment was a major turning point in Moses' life. He went from being a prince of Egypt to a fugitive, living in exile. It was in Midian, however, that Moses would begin to discover his true purpose. While in Midian, Moses found a new life. He married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian, and became a shepherd, tending to his father-in-law's flocks. For many years, Moses lived a quiet and humble life, far removed from the royal palace of Egypt and the struggles of his people. But Moses' life was far from over. One day, while tending the flocks near Mount Horeb, Moses had a life-changing encounter that would set him on the path to becoming one of the greatest leaders in history. He saw a bush that was on fire but not consumed by the flames. Intrigued, he approached, and from the burning bush, God spoke to him. God revealed that he had heard the cries of the Israelites and was ready to deliver them from their bondage. He commanded Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, demanding that he let the Israelites go. Moses, however, was hesitant. He doubted his ability to lead and feared that the people would not listen to him. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he asked. Exodus 3:11. But God reassured Moses, promising to be with him every step of the way. He gave Moses the power to perform signs and wonders, to prove to the people and to Pharaoh that he was sent by God. Reluctantly, but obediently, Moses accepted the mission. Moses returned to Egypt, accompanied by his brother Aaron, who served as his spokesman. Together they confronted Pharaoh, delivering God's message: "Let my people go so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness." Exodus 5:1. Pharaoh, however, refused. What followed was a dramatic series of events in which God unleashed 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, each one more severe than the last. From turning the Nile into blood to sending swarms of locusts and frogs, the plagues were a display of God's power and judgment. The final and most terrible plague was the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian household. But the Israelites were spared, as God instructed them to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. This event became known as the Passover, a key moment in the history of the Jewish people. After this final plague, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to leave. Moses led them out of Egypt, and they began their journey to the Promised Land. As the Israelites fled, Pharaoh had a change of heart and pursued them with his army. Trapped between Pharaoh's forces and the Red Sea, the Israelites were filled with fear and doubt. But Moses reassured them, saying, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. In a miraculous act, God parted the waters of the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to pass through on dry ground. When Pharaoh's army tried to follow, the waters closed in on them, drowning the soldiers and securing the Israelites' escape. This moment was a defining one in Moses' life and in the history of the Israelites. It symbolized their liberation from slavery and their trust in God's protection and guidance. After the miraculous parting of the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites found themselves on the other side, free from Egyptian bondage, but facing a new set of challenges. They were now in the wilderness, a vast and harsh desert where they would spend the next 40 years wandering before reaching the Promised Land. Though the Israelites had been freed, their faith was still weak. Almost immediately after their escape, they began to complain about the lack of food and water. This was the first test of Moses' leadership in the wilderness. Despite their complaints, Moses turned to God for guidance, and God provided for their needs. He sent manna, a type of bread that miraculously appeared on the ground each morning, and quail in the evening. Moses instructed the people to gather only what they needed for each day, teaching them to trust in God's daily provision. As they traveled through the desert, water also became a pressing need. At one point, the people grumbled to Moses because they had no water to drink. Moses, following God's instructions, struck a rock with his staff, and water flowed out to quench the people's thirst. These miraculous provisions showed God's continued care for his people, but it also revealed the ongoing struggle between faith and doubt among the Israelites. Yet Moses remained a patient leader, mediating between the people and God. Despite their frequent complaints and lack of trust, his ability to remain steadfast in the face of these challenges was one of the hallmarks of his leadership. One of the most significant moments in Moses' journey was when the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, a sacred place where they would encounter God in a profound way. It was here that Moses would receive the 10 Commandments, the cornerstone of the moral and legal code for the Israelites, and establish a covenant between God and his people. God called Moses to ascend the mountain, where he gave him the law, inscribed on 2 tablets of stone. These 10 Commandments outlined fundamental principles for living a life in accordance with God's will. They addressed the Israelites' relationship with God and with one another, covering areas such as worship, honor for parents, and prohibitions against murder, theft, and lying. The scene at Mount Sinai was awe-inspiring and terrifying for the Israelites. The mountain was covered in smoke. There was thunder and lightning, and the sound of a trumpet echoed through the air. The people were so frightened that they asked Moses to speak to God on their behalf, fearing that they might die if they encountered him directly. Moses acted as a mediator between God and the people, relaying God's words and instructions to them. He spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, during which God gave him detailed laws, not only the 10 Commandments, but also instructions for building the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where God's presence would dwell among his people. The giving of the law was a defining moment in the history of the Israelites. It formalized their relationship with God and set them apart as a people chosen to live by a higher moral standard. This covenant with God was at the heart of their identity, and Moses was the one who brought it to them. However, while Moses was on the mountain, the people below quickly lost faith. Growing impatient and unsure of what had happened to Moses, they persuaded Aaron, Moses' brother, to make a golden calf, which they worshipped as an idol. This act of rebellion was a grave sin in the eyes of God, who had explicitly commanded them not to worship other gods. When Moses descended the mountain and saw the people worshiping the golden calf, he was furious. In his anger, he threw down the tablets, breaking them. But Moses' anger was short-lived, and he once again interceded for the people, pleading with God to forgive their sin. God listened to Moses and renewed his covenant with the Israelites, though they faced consequences for their disobedience. This highlighted both Moses' role as a leader and his deep connection with God. Despite the people's unfaithfulness, Moses repeatedly advocated for them, asking for mercy and forgiveness. Leading the Israelites through the wilderness was no easy task. Moses faced constant challenges, not only from external threats, but also from within the camp. The people's lack of faith and constant grumbling wore heavily on Moses, and at times, even he struggled with the burden of leadership. In Numbers 11, we see one of these moments. The people once again complained about the lack of variety in their diet, longing for the food they had in Egypt. They grumbled about the manna, saying, "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Numbers 11:5-6. The complaints were so overwhelming that Moses, feeling the weight of his responsibility, cried out to God, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me." Numbers 11:11-14. In response, God provided Moses with help. He instructed Moses to gather 70 elders from among the people, and God placed his spirit on them so they could share the burden of leadership. This delegation of responsibility helped Moses manage the immense task of leading a nation through the wilderness. Yet even with this support, Moses continued to face challenges. At one point, his own siblings, Aaron and Miriam, spoke against him, questioning his leadership and his marriage to a Cushite woman. But God defended Moses, affirming his unique role as a prophet and leader. God said of Moses, "With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Numbers 12:8. Moses' leadership was not only about guiding the people, but also about maintaining his own relationship with God. His deep connection with God was evident throughout his life, and it was this relationship that sustained him through the trials and challenges he faced. One of the most dramatic challenges to Moses' leadership came in the form of a rebellion led by a man named Korah. Korah, along with 250 prominent leaders, challenged Moses' authority, arguing that all the people of Israel were holy and that Moses and Aaron had set themselves above the rest. This rebellion was not just a challenge to Moses' leadership, but also to God's chosen order. Moses responded by leaving the matter in God's hands. He told the rebels to gather the next day, and God would show whom he had chosen. The following day, God's judgment came swiftly and decisively. The ground opened up and swallowed Korah and his followers, and fire came down from heaven, consuming the 250 men who had followed him. This event served as a powerful reminder to the Israelites that Moses was indeed chosen by God to lead them, and any challenge to his leadership was a challenge to God's plan. Despite the severity of this judgment, Moses continued to act as a mediator for the people. When a plague broke out among the Israelites following the rebellion, Moses and Aaron interceded once again, and Aaron ran into the midst of the people with a censer of incense to stop the plague, saving many lives. One of the most heartbreaking moments in Moses' journey came when the Israelites reached Kadesh, on the border of the Promised Land. Here, Moses faced one of the greatest disappointments of his life. the failure of the Israelites to trust in God and enter the land he had promised them. God had instructed Moses to send 12 spies into the land of Canaan to explore it and report back on its condition. The spies returned with news that the land was indeed rich and fertile, flowing with milk and honey. Numbers 13:27. However, 10 of the spies also brought back a fearful report about the strength of the people living there, describing them as giants and claiming that the Israelites would be unable to conquer them. Despite the pleas of Joshua and Caleb, 2 of the spies who believed in God's promise, the people were overcome with fear and refused to enter the land. They even talked about returning to Egypt, rejecting Moses' leadership and doubting God's ability to deliver them. As a result of their lack of faith, God decreed that the current generation of Israelites, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, would not enter the promised land. Instead, they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years until a new generation had grown up. This was a crushing blow for Moses, who had worked so hard to lead the people to this point, only to see them falter in their faith. Yet even in the face of this setback, Moses remained committed to leading the people and preparing them for the future. He continued to guide them through the wilderness, teaching them God's laws and preparing the next generation for the challenges ahead. One of the most poignant moments in Moses' life occurred later in the journey, when the Israelites once again complained about a lack of water. God instructed Moses to speak to a rock, and water would flow from it to satisfy the people's thirst. However, in a moment of frustration, Moses struck the rock with his staff instead of speaking to it, as God had commanded. While water did flow from the rock, this act of disobedience had serious consequences for Moses. God told him that because he had not honored him before the people, he would not be allowed to enter the promised land. This moment was a turning point in Moses' life. After all the years of leading the Israelites and enduring their complaints, doubts, and rebellions, Moses' own moment of weakness cost him the opportunity to see the fulfillment of God's promise. Yet, even in this moment of personal failure, Moses continued to serve God and lead the people faithfully. As Moses continued leading the Israelites through the wilderness, his mission shifted toward preparing them for a future without him. He knew that his time as their leader was coming to an end and that he would not be entering the promised land himself. Yet, his focus remained on ensuring that the next generation would be ready to inherit the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses' preparation of the Israelites involved not only practical instructions for living in the promised land, but also spiritual teachings. He understood that the key to the Israelites' success in the land would be their faithfulness to God and his commandments. To this end, Moses spent a significant amount of time teaching and reinforcing the laws that God had given him, encouraging the people to live by these laws in order to prosper. One of the most important moments in this process was the delivery of Moses' final speeches, which are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. In these speeches, Moses reminded the Israelites of all that God had done for them, from their deliverance from Egypt to their victories over enemy nations in the wilderness. He also recounted the commandments and laws that God had given them, urging the people to follow them faithfully. Moses' speeches in Deuteronomy were not just a recap of past events. They were a passionate call to action. He reminded the Israelites that their future success depended on their relationship with God. Moses knew that the temptations of the surrounding nations could easily lead the people astray, so he emphasized the importance of staying true to their covenant with God. One of the most well-known passages from these speeches is the Shema, a prayer still recited by Jews today. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Deuteronomy 6:4-7. Moses stressed that the Israelites were to teach these laws to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that future generations would remain faithful to God's covenant. He also warned them of the consequences of disobedience, reminding them of the rebellion at Kadesh and the many other times when the people's lack of faith had brought hardship upon them. As the time approached for Moses to step down, It was crucial for the Israelites to have a new leader to guide them into the Promised Land. God instructed Moses to appoint Joshua, a man who had already proven his faithfulness and leadership abilities, as his successor. Joshua had been by Moses' side for many years, serving as his assistant and a military leader. He was one of the 12 spies sent to scout the land of Canaan, and along with Caleb, he had been one of the few to trust in God's promise that the Israelites could conquer the land, despite the challenges. His faith in God and his loyalty to Moses made him the ideal candidate to lead the people after Moses' death. In a public ceremony, Moses laid his hands on Joshua, commissioning him as the new leader. This act of laying on hands symbolized the transfer of authority and responsibility from Moses to Joshua. God himself confirmed this appointment, telling Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." Joshua 1:6. Moses, in his final address to the people, encouraged Joshua and the Israelites with these words, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Deuteronomy 31:6. Despite knowing that he would not enter the Promised Land himself, Moses was at peace with this transition. He trusted that God had chosen Joshua for this important task, and he reassured the people that God's presence would remain with them even after his own death. Moses' death marked the end of an era for the Israelites. He had led them for over 40 years, through some of the most tumultuous and transformative moments in their history. But before his death, Moses had one final task: to see the Promised Land from afar. God took Moses to the top of Mount Nebo, where he showed him the vast expanse of the land that the Israelites would soon inherit. From this vantage point, Moses could see the land of Canaan spread out before him, a land he had long dreamed of entering. Yet as God had decreed, Moses would not step foot in it. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Deuteronomy 34:4. Moses died on Mount Nebo at the age of 120, and God himself buried him in an undisclosed location in the land of Moab. His death was mourned by the Israelites, who wept for him for 30 days. Despite not entering the Promised Land, Moses' legacy endured. He was remembered as the greatest prophet of Israel, the man through whom God had delivered his people from slavery and given them his law. His humility, faithfulness, and perseverance made him a model for future generations. The book of Deuteronomy ends with this tribute to Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Deuteronomy 34:10-12. Moses' influence extended far beyond his own time. His life and teachings became the foundation of Jewish law and identity. His leadership during the Exodus became a symbol of liberation and divine deliverance, not just for the Israelites, but for countless people throughout history. The law he received at Mount Sinai laid the groundwork for ethical and moral systems that would shape societies for centuries to come. Moses' impact is felt in several ways. First and foremost, his leadership during the Exodus forever changed the course of history for the Israelite nation. He led them from slavery to freedom, transforming them from a group of oppressed people into a nation chosen by God to carry his message to the world. Secondly, Moses' role as a lawgiver was unparalleled. The 10 Commandments and the laws that Moses delivered to the Israelites at Mount Sinai form the bedrock of Jewish, Christian, and even secular legal systems. His emphasis on justice, compassion, and the sanctity of life has influenced the development of human rights and ethics in countless cultures. Moreover, Moses' faith in God and his unwavering commitment to carrying out God's will, despite immense obstacles, make him a powerful figure of inspiration. His willingness to stand before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and demand freedom for his people, showed courage and faith beyond measure. His endurance during the 40 years in the wilderness, despite the people's constant complaints and rebellions, revealed his extraordinary patience and dedication. Lastly, Moses' life is a testimony to God's grace and mercy. Though Moses was far from perfect, he doubted his ability to lead. He acted out of anger at times, and he disobeyed God's direct command at Meribah. God continued to work through him. This reminds us that even flawed individuals can accomplish great things when they trust in God and follow his guidance. The life of Moses offers many lessons that remain relevant today. One of the most powerful lessons is the importance of perseverance. Moses faced overwhelming challenges throughout his life, from Pharaoh's resistance to the constant grumbling of the Israelites. Yet he never gave up. He continued to trust in God's plan, even when it seemed impossible. Moses also teaches us the value of humility. Despite his position as a leader and prophet, Moses is described as more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Numbers 12:3. He never sought power for his own sake, but always acted in service to God and his people. His humility allowed him to be open to God's guidance and correction, and it was one of the qualities that made him such an effective leader. Another key lesson from Moses' life is the importance of faith. Time and again, Moses placed his trust in God, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain or dangerous. His faith enabled him to confront Pharaoh, part the Red Sea, and lead the Israelites through the wilderness. Moses' faith in God's promises never wavered, and this faith sustained him through the hardest moments of his journey. Finally, Moses' life demonstrates the power of obedience. Even when Moses questioned his own abilities, he remained obedient to God's commands. He didn't always understand God's plan, and at times he struggled with frustration and doubt, but he continued to follow God's instructions. His obedience ultimately led to the liberation of the Israelites and the establishment of a covenant between God and his people. Moses' life was extraordinary, marked by incredible achievements and profound challenges. He was a man chosen by God to lead his people out of slavery, to deliver his law, and to prepare the Israelites for their future in the Promised Land. Though he never entered the Promised Land himself, Moses' legacy is one of faith, perseverance, and humility. His teachings continue to influence the world today. Moses is remembered not only as a great leader, but as a prophet who knew God face to face. His life is a testament to the power of faith and the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when the path ahead is unclear. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more biblical history.